Who's watching and who's deceiving? First, we're going to have Jan Fernback presenting her paper co-authored by Sam Srauy, Structurally Dictated Surveillance, the Ethics of Sorting Mobile Phone Users. And then right up after Jan, we'll have Torsten Busch, Surveillance, Capitalism Turned Outside In, Big Data-Driven Workplace Surveillance in Switzerland. And finally, we'll have Joanne Oravec, Ethical Dimensions of Deception and Cheating Detection. So, Jan.
Thanks, Megan. Okay. My co-author, Sam Srauy, isn't here. He has a new baby, and he used that as an excuse. So this paper is using Foucault's concept of disciplinary power as well as critical race theory to consider policy recommendations aimed at addressing privacy risks with a focus on low-income, minority, and immigrant mobile users. And, excuse me, sorry, I usually do text-heavy slides, but not for my students. Citizens of a lot of economically disadvantaged communities are mostly internet users, largely due to the fact that they either don't have a landline or home computer, and also due to the inability to access reasonably priced internet services from mainstream ISPs. So these disadvantaged communities are thus denied participation in networked publics in ways that include accessing the web through desktop and laptop devices. Most people don't protect their cell phones as they do desktop and laptop computers, and I'm guessing that's also many of us in this room with things like virus and malware protection. How many of you actually delete cookies on your cell phones or empty the cache? And so this is a particularly interesting practice for people who are mostly internet users. Increasingly, we all are dependent on smartphone access to participate in the modern world, and therefore we leave a lot of data traces as we're doing this. Traces include things like IP address, phone number, contacts, credit card information, etc. And these traces ultimately serve to segment us into these marketable segments. And I stole that image from Choice Point or Axiom, I forget which data broker I took that from, but that's an image illustrating, how we are all part of these marketable segments. And so all groups are at risk, as I mentioned, but it's particularly problematic in the context of communities of color and impoverished communities, because those bodies, in the Foucauldian sense, are literally able to be tracked using GPS technologies, because we're all tracked on our phones, but they're using their phones, mostly internet users, for practically everything, which leaves them more vulnerable to some of these types of practices. Updates to older phones are frequently non-existent, as they're abandoned for newer phones. And phone vulnerabilities make mostly users more open to privacy violations. We don't tend to think about things like update lag and unpatched vulnerabilities in older phones, but these are particularly important for communities of color and people who are mostly mostly users, So this is some preliminary data I collected in Long Beach back in May. You can see there the age range, and there were 10 Latino participants and 3 African American participants. And the comments here I've just distilled down. They indicate a general unawareness of what privacy as both a legal and social concept is about. They seem to support these contentions that consumers are willing to trade privacy for convenience, the well-known privacy paradox. I thought in particular the comment that the government already has your information was pretty interesting. And I was pleased to see that a few of the participants didn't download some apps if they felt like they were invasive. But for the most part, there is, as I mentioned, a general unawareness indicated in this data of what kind of privacy violations, both socially and legally, are possible for these populations. So in Foucault's concept of disciplinary power, we discipline ourselves in the form of self-monitoring for the fear of exposure. And it no longer matters whether there's an authority behind the screens or not for people to manage or even censor their conduct. What's at stake is human agency and the discourse of morality that must remain, in my eyes, the locus of every discussion about power and digital citizenry. The surveillance environment is a product of the evolution of information society from other types of social orders based on punishment, discipline, and control. And this power is efficient, and this power is dehumanizing. These are some examples. There are implications for individuals, for society, for privacy, for democracy. The invasion of privacy in the service of capitalist priorities is cheap, profitable, and effective. So therefore, these sell-mostly user communities are triply harmed by lack of industry impulse to offer access to technologies, by design norms for cell phones that are still limiting, and by vulnerability through security features in mobile phones that allow for disproportionate tracking. And we don't even think about the fact that sometimes cell phones are shared among these populations in particular. Yeah, my favorite one of these is that teletrack deliberately trying to target financially strapped customers. Okay, so what I wanted to do here was try to add an extra layer onto Foucault's concept of disciplinary power by using critical race theory. And discipline, sorry, I have a bit of a cold. I apologize for clearing my throat so much. Discipline expanded the political body through institutional requirements that individual bodies be observed, trained, or otherwise manipulated in order to function in the new political, economic, or institutional arrangements, according to Foucault. So critical race theory adds this extra layer to Foucault's concepts by recognizing experiences of people of color in socio-legal constructs. We worry that a surveillance state impinges on dignity and freedom. And privacy encompasses the concepts of territory in the form of environmental intrusion, information, of course, in the form of personal data, the body itself, as in physical intrusions like drug testing, and also communication, as in the forms of wiretapping or hacking. And so dignity and ethics go hand in hand. We often forget that. Policymakers forget that. Oh, I stole that slide. I stole that picture from privacyinternational.org, and I forgot to cite it. So as a person who teaches copyright law, I need to show that this is fair use and what my source is. Okay. So clearly, we have to have access to the internet, but we're far from equitable access. And so that leads to these second-order digital divides, including things that you see there in those bullets, divides among people who have the technical means, software, hardware, to be able to have full access to the information economy. Autonomy of use, social support networks, your skills, the ability to use the internet effectively. All of these things contribute to that second-order digital divide, a much more complex process. So this slide is about attempting to inform people about the consequences of mobile privacy breaches, but not only do they need to be informed, the dominant design paradigm for online technologies needs to be updated. So that last sub-bullet there talks about responsive web design. It has been lauded as this make once, play on any screen design format, but assumptions about large screen practices result in a lack of good design that's translated to smaller smartphone screens. And even though there are some examples of good responsive design, for the most part, the sites that we really need access to, things like some governmental sites or sites for aid, healthcare sites, things like that, they really do not translate very well to the small screen. And so what we see then is differential monitoring between cell phones and desktops and laptops. And a lot more information is revealed from mobile phones. So we can see here, and I'm sure most of us are aware of this, but a lot of information that's shared from your phone goes into the cloud's not secure, your phone's not secure. But this goes way beyond the information that's shared in desktop or laptop devices. So you can see here things like the settings of your device, app data, call history. Those are things that can really collectively provide a very detailed picture about a person. So then what happens is distrust and fear can result from being differentially monitored, and the freedom to engage in social life and dignity can be lost. And so, sort of dovetailing a little bit onto Professor Zuboff's comments earlier, Capital's interest is obviously in the commoditization of private data vis-a-vis GPS data. And so the preliminary interview data that I talked about here show that the marginalized people that I interviewed do have privacy concerns because they see governments as the sole boogeyman. By doing so, they fall to some degree into those neoliberal discourses that see capital's interests as necessarily virtuous and interests of government as necessarily abusive. And GPS tracking by corporate entities may be as harmful as tracking propagated by governments, as we know, but corporate tracking tends to be overlooked by these sell-mostly users, since they and all of us are primed by neoliberal discourses to expect surveillance abuses by government. We see that in the informant's comments that he didn't care about monitoring by ISPs and corporations. That obviously indicates the fact that we've been primed to care more about governmental abuses of our data than we do about corporate abuses of our data. So in this sense, mostly users are misdirected at whom to criticize. And their interests about, well, I don't want to be surveilled, is supplanted by capital's interests. Well, you shouldn't want to be surveilled by the government. And this is why the disproportionate surveillance environment, in my opinion, can be viewed as a moral issue. Thanks. Sorry, I didn't realize I was at the end there. Thank you. Okay. Let's do questions at the end. Probably.
Does that work? That works. Fantastic. Hi there. So I'm Torsten, and before I do anything else, I'd like to thank Don wherever he went, because he's seen this before. But I'd like to thank Don and the entire team for rocking this. It's been another great iteration and another great year, and another great program, and I'm really happy to be here for, I think, like 4 and 7 is what I've got going now. So I'm a regular, I think. I'm going to talk a little bit about surveillance capitalism now, and that's embarrassing, quite frankly, after this morning's keynote. So I'm going to just try to just avoid talking about that. Okay, just going to instead. No, it's just maybe later. I don't know. Anyway, this is me. I'm showing you this pic of my Twitter account because A, it's the best life advice I've ever gotten, coming from a Nintendo game, of course. That's at the top. The other thing I want to show you is you may want to direct your attention to all the way to the right, where Twitter suggested I follow at the very same time a privacy organization and the NSA. So if you are worried that AI is going to be too smart and take over the world very soon, rest assured it's going to take a little while longer before they figured us out. From there, I'm going to have to introduce myself as a business ethicist, and this is kind of what everybody thinks a business ethicist looks like. It's important for us to point fingers at the baddies, right? It's important for us to have a beard because that suggests we're very wise people. And also it's important to have a bunch of commandments with you. And in the commandments industry, 10 is the number of commandments you want to go for. If you have 9 commandments, you're not going to make it in the market, okay? So now here's the reaction that I get as a business ethicist from Silicon Valley. And that is unfortunate. If I had a nickel for every time somebody told me, oh my God, you're a digital business ethicist, we need more people like that. And then I say, well, why don't you just hire me? Then everybody's like, yeah, I don't know. It sounds like you're messing up our business a little bit. So that's unfortunate, really. But going from there, I'm going to tell you a little bit about surveillance, right? And as Kirsty Ball says in this paper from 2010, it's a little overview. Any discussion of workplace surveillance begins with the idea that surveillance and business organizations go hand in hand, and that employee monitoring is nothing new. So you could say, okay then, capitalism as usual, I suppose, and, oh Jen, I'm very sorry, I'm not putting any kind of copyright notices on this. Dear students, do not follow this example. But yeah, point is, we've kind of gotten used to surveillance in the workplace, right? It's just a normal thing. But now what happens if you add big data and all that kind of stuff, and machine learning and AI, and you put it into this wonderful context here, then you get the worst possible combination of things, and that's rather unpleasant because now we're being surveilled at work to a degree that just simply was not possible before, and that is very granular and very, very unpleasant. And one of the things that I found interesting in a project over the summer that I was working on was using the concept of surveillance capitalism and then looking at management theory and how they think about observations. And there's this paper here by Ethan Bernstein from this summer that basically says we're going to look at how management theorists think about observation and monitoring, right? And he basically summarizes this entire body of management literature, stating that he finds a shift, in the object of observation from organizational outcomes to the detailed individual activities within them. So we're not just merely monitoring team outcomes or anything, right? But we're looking at what people do on a highly granular basis, and we have data on that these days, right? We will see, second, a shift from people observing the technology to technology observing people. And then C, and this is what I found the most interesting, a split in the field with managers viewing observation almost entirely from the observer's perspective, leaving the perspective of the observed to the realm of scholarly methodology courses and philosophical debates on bias, right? So management theorists have, in many, many ways, sort of just neglected to take on the perspective of the observed. It's not a thing we're very much interested in, and that is unfortunate. So now, adding all fancy technology to workplace surveillance, we're ending up in places like this, where the New York Times reported on a company in the US that now uses a Swedish microchip implant that you can get in your, basically here in your thumb, right? You can inject that thing there, and then that replaces all kinds of P cards and all kinds of other things. It's an RFID chip in your hand. It's going to open doors. It's going to let you use the Xerox machine. It's going to let you pay for your coffee at the cafeteria, right? That's kind of the state of the art. And this particular company management asked whether people wanted to join that program or whether they preferred the old ways, and 50% of people just decided to join and have that thing implanted into their hand. So what we're going to see increasingly is that's the first wave. We're going to ask kindly whether somebody's interested in pioneering this, and then at some point it's going to become mandatory, right? Because you don't want to have all that legacy infrastructure lying around. Now, moving closer to home in terms of the Swiss industry, right? This is what happens in banking. JP Morgan algorithm knows you're a rogue employee before you do. This is Bloomberg News, and sorry, the video there. I locked my browser down quite a bit in terms of privacy, so that video did not show. But yeah, this is what we're trying to do now, apparently, right? We're trying to figure out whether some investment banker, because they have a bit of a reputation, try to screw over their own companies, and so the company has a vested interest in figuring out whether somebody's going to go rogue or not. And then Barclays in London recently was in the news because they use a sensor in the office to see if employees are at their desks or not, where the rationale is, well, office space in London is pretty expensive. We can cut down on all that kind of stuff. So if people don't actually work from the office, but they're seeing clients or whatever other thing, we want to know, and we want to just reduce square footage, basically, right, of the square footage we're renting in the city of London. So now you will be shocked to find that people don't necessarily like this kind of thing, right? And one suggestion I have for why that is because now it hits white people, quite frankly. This is a thing where surveillance has been normal in, say, the all kinds of industries that were blue-collar traditionally, right? But now surveillance is hitting white-collar work in big time, and so everybody's freaking the heck out. So, for instance, this is a wonderful combination here: Credit Suisse and Palantir teaming up in a what could possibly go wrong kind of arrangement, trying to figure out how to identify rogue bankers, right? Now, speaking of whiteness, I'm, of course, like in the whitest country on earth, pretty much. So now we're looking at the way that we now surveil employees in Switzerland. That's a case study and a pretty ginormous one. You will find me in the northeast of that map of Switzerland if you want to ever come to St. Gallen. It's pretty and boring, but you can come there and I will show you around. Now, the thing is, nobody cares about Switzerland, so I'm going to move on to the thing that people do actually care about. If you introduce the kind of surveillance that I just quickly talked about, that's going to have some effects on organizational culture, to the effect that there's a certain language that's now being deployed throughout the organization, and it's going to be difficult to argue against the language of data whenever you have something that is actually a genuinely human kind of issue. We all have conflicts, we all have all kinds of identity issues we bring to work, and the workplace is an incredibly complex field in which people negotiate a lot of things. Now, if you introduce the language of data into this, that is going to make pretty much everything else kind of invisible and irrelevant. Problems here are that the language of data basically lacks moral imagination, right? So anything we can't really show using data then apparently must not exist, I suppose. And all the moral conflicts that we do in fact have in organizations are going to just be crowded out. Big data also, in terms of its logic and language, marginalizes certain human qualities, right? So there's a lot of care work, or the labor of care that happens in industries, right, where we do a lot of things that contribute to the overall success of a company, but if we can't put numbers to it, well, then that's not going to be visible. And at the end of the year, if you want to have a bonus, well, you better focus on those indicators that we can quantify, and not on picking up the pieces when some of your coworkers have some kind of emotional crisis going on, right? But somebody needs to do that later. And then, lastly, I think big data overemphasizes blind trust in rules. If there's not a process for it, well, we're not going to do it. And all the things that we deem important, looking at the objective data, we will find rules and regulations for. Everything else does not necessarily count. So that presents us with a problem, because integrity increasingly then is going to be futile. Integrity meaning if you can actually be yourself at work, integritas means in Latin being undivided or whole. Increasingly at work, we're going back to sort of like Taylorist fantasies of the things that we want to micromanage the hell out of. But integrity is sort of falling by the wayside in that case, right? And that is unfortunate and really needs to be countered. So this is my slide that I always show. With great power comes great responsibility in those kinds of organizational settings where we see the logic of surveillance capitalism and just monitoring in general pervade throughout the industry. And I'm very sorry that I can't give you a quick shot just recipe to pour some ethics sauce on top of this and then fix all these issues, but that's not really a thing we can do. What we do need, though, is an intervention. This is what an intervention looks like in Europe. This is what it looks like over here. So we're kind of going to need this kind of thing, where somebody has to intervene and say, wait a minute, maybe we're headed in the wrong direction there. And now this is for the Star Trek nerds. If you remember the second Star Trek movie from sometime in the 80s, there's the Kobayashi Maru scenario, right? And for the youngsters up there, I'm going to explain that. That is a scenario in which Starfleet Academy officers get trained and they are being put into a situation where they have to either save a civilian vessel, thereby basically committing suicide and also putting Starfleet into a conflict with the Klingons, or just not save the vessel. So it's a lose-lose scenario, right? And there's So the classic move that James T. Kirk then makes is to hack the computer and change the programming. And I feel like in line with your recommendations, I feel like that's pretty much a thing we should probably be doing. Instead of thinking this is a thing we cannot win, and this is a thing we have no options in, and this is a thing where we're just bystanders, maybe we need to hack that system a little bit. So here's 3 things that I feel like any organization increasingly is going to need in order to do that. We're going to need way higher ethical awareness. And if you look at a company and its structures, that means, for instance, the techies need to know about the ethical implications of what they do. HR needs to know about the ethical implications, right? But HR also increasingly needs tech knowledge, right? If you wanna figure out, should our company buy a product by Cisco or Google or Microsoft or whoever who actually enables all this workload monitoring, HR needs to know how that works technically, and they need to know how the implications of that just play out ethically, right? So we also need critical data literacy. And that is kind of unclear what that means at this point, right? I would think it's sort of a combination of risk assessment and the ethical consequences of this, and then also stakeholder involvement. And that leads us to value-sensitive design. Instead of just buying some kind of wholesale HR analytics software, for instance, you could do that thing yourself or work with an agency where your employees have a say in what gets monitored, to what extent does it get monitored, and by what kind of indicators do you want to be measured at the end of the year come bonus time. So I would think value-sensitive design is a pretty good tool to do that. Unfortunately, from the empirical findings we have from Switzerland, hardly anybody is compelled to do this because all these wonderful tech companies have these fantastic one-size-fits-all things like Watson, right? And so you market the heck out of these one-size-fits-all approaches, and I think that's kind of a slippery slope to go down. And with that, I think I'm done. And indeed, I did not even cease my hand. Yes. Thank you very much. So moving on. Great. Okay.
If you could bring my presentation. And I'll start talking about honesty. And that whole word rings kind of false, because we've been talking about surveillance, which is supposed to prevent the need for us to be honest or be worried about other people being honest. But we'll talk about some of the reasons why we're still concerned about this, and some of the reasons why the research now, some very interesting research, some of which I was involved in earlier this summer, is we look at how we reflect that. And all those terms, again, we're talking about news, we're talking about line, television line, or rack, as we've been during that race. And what will we be doing in the future to make sure that people are, let's say, effective sensors for that? I'll unpack that as we go along. So big data profiling, surveillance, and wearable technology to keep us honest. And again, the technology could be headed in the direction where some of this is needed, and then the big data analyses, which have to be such that people are no longer part of the system of surveillance and all of that, of the people's mentalities or honest. But let's explore. So, I focus on one topic, of course, human beings play this role. They're the things. The first one is internet related talk about. So we'll unpack that a little bit, but we call all these sensors these internet-based intelligence. This So, but the last one, okay, really, again, the research, I know that part of it as well, the handle predict lying and all that. So it's a very interesting study. There's also one that's like aggregated large-scale samples of that. One of the more predictive factors, useful factors, and looking at society. There are a number of other interesting cameras we're working on exclusive. Now, level identifications can also be working. So, again, keyword price, you can often see if you design your technology right, how people are using their hands. You can see by web what we're doing with our other voice computers in so many ways we can computer stuff. And of course, human mouse interaction can accurately detect fake response. Traces can be very useful. And of course, we're learning something about we've got incredible advances in how technology is I got 2 minutes of moving machines and factories, etc. Essentially deceptive gestures and unconscious thinking as well related to how humans use those hands and of course unintentional and so cultural differences and all that, perhaps in the future we'll have
higher the and that's the discussion right? And then, so that's always going to be some kind of different area.
But I would also add that I think that there has, as so-called digital natives get older and older, and this becomes more of a widespread social phenomenon, that there will be some sort of sociological differentiating that evolves from the realities that you're describing. Just a tiny example is lots of employers ask prospective employees for their Facebook passwords. So I know a lot of my students just have the fake Facebook for employers and then the real one for friends. And in New Jersey now, it's illegal for employers to ask for prospective employees' Facebook passwords. So there's one little tiny, foray into that new way of thinking. And I mean, our data are being used against us in so many ways that have been outlined, from every speaker